yeah, there is such a story about the way that we develop through time and how our interactions with our parents or caregivers and environment really shapes who we are as adults. But I like to stress that that's just a platform for where we begin our journeys in adulthood, where we have opportunities to really learn and grow and change. Working in some kind of therapeutic capacity for people, meaning I began in the education world, teaching and working with children, mostly on the autistic spectrum and the weird diagnosis of emotional disabilities. Mainly, I found it was emotional regulation, teachings that were needed by the people that I was working with. I've worked with parents and families. I've worked with adults. I've worked with couples. The cool thing about being in the world of behavioral sciences is that every living being has behaviors. And so you get to really experience a really wide variety of behaviors and people. I took that and created my own approach, mixing what I know about biology and neurobiology in particular, what I've learned in my studies as a yogi, what I've learned from my fairy godmother, mentor, mama, Joyce Wyden, Dr. Joyce Wyden. She's taught me a lot about quantum physics and other realms and more traditional schools of psychology. So I really merged what I've learned that I found really enlightening and helpful and kept me curious about behavior change and learning. And I've applied it in a wide variety of settings.
I'm a mom. I have a 5-year-old. And as you know, I'm a survivor of domestic violence. And it is my belief and understanding that domestic violence is generational, and the effects of it can start in the womb.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the development that happens in utero, because that's where the relationship, well, I wouldn't say that's where the relationship starts. The relationship probably starts before that, when we're an egg in grandma, right? And that's why trauma does generationally get passed on, because our DNA, our genetics, you know, when we're part of the egg, when we're part of the sperm that we come from, that gets developed having certain experiences in life. And so certain patterns really get programmed in. I don't want to say locked in, but get programmed in. The first environment that we're in contact in, and we're in contact as we're growing, right? Where did this begin? How did this happen? Why do we do the things we do? Typically, we could link it back even to what was mom going through when she was pregnant. My days in research were in applied behavioral analysis, which is very hard science about observable behaviors. But I always felt like there was a missing piece to that story. And in studying, you know, neurobiology and cellular biology, Bruce Lipton's work comes to mind right now, where he talks about the research associated with the development of the sense of self, and how most of our sense of self is developed by the age of 7. Most of it. I think it's like 50% by age 4. These patterns get really deeply ingrained into the subconscious. And then when certain parts of the brain start developing, we have the opportunity to change our subconscious patterning, because we have more access to prefrontal cortex conscious thinking that can really understand, oh, I do this because, but I don't have to do it that way anymore. I could try something that's a little less familiar to me, but actually has more comforting results. Something that is very important in my line of work is to really look at each individual as individual. Patterns that we have found, you see a lot of people grow up to not learn that their own self-worth is actually the most important thing. that they tend to be such good caregivers because the narcissistic parent, you know, it's all about them, right? It's never really about the child. Even if it's about the child, it's because the child is a reflection of themselves, you know? So people tend to grow up not really recognizing the importance of their own needs and listening to themselves first and foremost. They tend to be almost overbearing partners, you know, that and more of an anxious attachment style. You see kids taking care of their parents instead of the other way around. And so as adults, they tend to seek that out in other relationships and have a hard time receiving. They're very good givers. They have a hard time receiving. As a behaviorist and someone who's a strong believer that people can change, I've witnessed it. I've seen it happen. I want to say, yes, I do believe that someone with narcissistic tendencies can learn empathy. There are actually research-based, peer-reviewed studies on how to elicit empathy. And these studies were done more with children on the autistic spectrum. That, you know, we see that empathic ways of being aren't as natural to people on the autistic spectrum, but it can be induced. You can teach that. Now, if we catch certain things at a younger age, it's much easier to learn and adapt. But neuroplasticity, our capacity to learn and grow and change, is with us till the day we die. There's specific techniques, and it takes a lot of focus and direct energy in a certain form to get to that place. It's not like some casual talking therapy, you know, once a week is going to teach you how to be an empathetic person. You know, it takes real drills, there's real scientific technique to eliciting certain responses to train the nervous system to attend to other in a different way. Yeah, so I think it's possible. It just takes a lot of hard work. And the thing that gets in the way, I think, is it's very hard for a narcissistic person to identify that they are narcissistic. And when you want to change something, you have to want to change something and recognize it, right? So it gets a little tricky. Yeah. Did some of this research with my dissertation where you would play games. Play is, it's much faster to learn through play than any other way. And I would set up contingencies with games where you would need to elicit information from another. And you wouldn't be able to win unless you did it in connection with another, which is called peer-yoked contingencies. You know, silly games like blindfold yourself, and then you have to ask questions from a partner to understand what something is, right? Things of that nature to really link reinforcement with connection. And out information and listening so that it's reinforcing to listen, not listening because I'm told to listen and I have to, and it actually feels really punishing, but wanting to get information from somebody else in a way that both people can move forward together. Those kinds of contingencies really help as a starting point to create a sense of empathy, linking, yoking someone with connection.
If trauma in childhood is left to fester and grow and is never really addressed, and there's no counseling, there's no support, if that is left to continue, how can that manifest in an adult? Personally, in relationships, in work, in society, in health issues.
It depends on the kind of trauma, how that manifests later in life. If it's trauma relating to neglect, it's going to look different than trauma relating to violence and physical abuse, right? So I feel like that question can have a really wide array of answers.
Okay.
You know, different attachment styles are observed when we're undergoing different types of trauma. It's going to affect your relationships. It's going to affect your capacity to follow through and therefore work. Maybe you follow through too obsessively, which might get you ahead, or maybe you were never reinforced to be able to have any sort of follow through, and so life is constantly feeling chaotic and disorganized, and adulthood emulates that. It's obviously also going to really affect your sense of safety, a person's sense of safety. And our sense of safety, I believe, plays one of the biggest roles in how we interact with our environment, because if we don't feel safe, and if we don't understand what safe feels like, then we're always in a defensive posture. And if we're always in a defensive posture, then we're not going to be able to access choice. We're just going to be reacting all of the time.
Let me ask you about one area, because this is something that happened to me as a child that I've never really talked to anyone about. So this is going to be news to some people once I say this. I was molested as a child, and there was never any support or counseling or therapy or anything like that. The first time I even sat down with a counselor, I think I was maybe 19. I have no idea how that affected me. I have no idea how I developed out of that. I have no clue. I know that in my relationships, I seem fairly normal, but that's from inside my own brain. Like I've never hurt myself. I've never been promiscuous. I never went like way left or way right, but I just don't know how that affected how I developed, or how, I don't know. So how, like, what type of effects could that have had on me?
You know, I first want to say, thank you for sharing that with me. That's not an easy thing to talk about when it's not practiced. That having that being a new thing to come up in conversation for you is pretty big. So I appreciate you sharing with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's brave. I was listening to a talk by Peter Levine, who he's kind of like the father of somatic therapies. And it was on sexuality and sexual development. And he was talking about how we really have no idea what healthy sexual development looks like.
Okay.
We really don't, because they're finding that even the way we're potty trained has an effect on our sexual development, because it's the first time we're using our genitals to control or release, right? And the either punishment or reinforcement associated with that will affect our sexual development. And when I heard that, I was like, whoa. Wow.
Yeah, that's good.
Right? Thinking about that in itself, even taking trauma out of the equation for a minute, that one piece right there, so many people can have side effects from, parents being super punishing or shaming, right? In that stage of life. Our idea of what is healthy, I think, as a society isn't, we haven't really been able to actualize much of that, especially since, people have only recently been more openly talking about sexuality and differences in sexual preferences and, gender, the idea of gender, right? Everything has kind of been more open and questioned these days. So we really have no idea what it means to have healthy development. A lot of people, it's very sad, most people that I talk to, I would say, there is some kind of molestation that happened in childhood. It's a very common thing, which is heartbreaking. And the thing that I find the most heartbreaking is that a lot of people don't fully remember or understand what happened. And there aren't really adults in their lives to ask those questions to. There's a lot of mystery around what happened to me. I know something happened, but I don't exactly know what. Knowing that our body holds certain memories, which are called implicit memory. Memory that we don't have a narrative around or a sequence around, like this happened, and this happened, and this happened. That's an explicit memory. Implicit memories are memories that the body holds on to, and then we behave in certain ways because something triggers those memories. And sometimes as we start to be in conversation about something like this, and you're saying, you know, I haven't spoken about this, opening up that door for yourself, something happens in the brain where implicit memories start to get associated sometimes with explicit memory. The brain starts linking connections as we get comfort in talking about it, which is kind of wild, but it's how we function. You know, and sometimes certain kinks are there, and it's because of that. And it's like, that's part of my sexual preference. I get pleasure out of it, and that's okay. You know, and I think a lot of people tend to go into more of a space of shame around these topics when, you know, there's so many different things that associate with how we behave sexually. And if we can understand why, then we could be a little looser about it or more comfortable with it and not feel ashamed by it.
Something else happened in regards to during my DV experience that I wasn't aware of. I was watching a movie and I didn't know it, but I had ice cream in my hand and it was just melting down my arm. And I'm an actress, so I mean, I can pretty much watch anything and I'm okay with it because, you know, I know what goes into these types of scenes. And for some reason, this one hit really deeply. I had to sit there and I had to watch, and I had to watch it through to the end. I guess maybe I had to see that there was going to be some justice for this young lady. I went to group therapy, so I voiced what had happened, and the counselor came over to me and said, no matter how you expressed it, no matter how you felt about it, if you didn't want it, that was rape. Have you ever had any clients who came in talking about marital rape? And clearly, I'm aware that that is a thing now. That is a real thing.
Well, you know, I think it's important. I want to share my own vulnerabilities with you. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And, you know, it's really interesting that going through the experiences that I went through and talking to people who've gone through these experiences, what my most profound takeaway, it's touching on what you're saying, that most people don't really understand when they're being raped. There's these dangerous scenes that we see in movies where it's like, okay, yeah, that's clearly rape, right? Where a stranger attacks you in the park or something. But when it's relational, it gets really confusing for us. Something that I also recognize going through my own personal experiences was he didn't understand that what he was doing was rape. And so often we think, because we're in a relationship, that the expectations we have should just be matched by other, or that because other people have certain expectations, we have to submit to them. And that is not true. It's simply not true.
Right.
But it does get very confusing.
Yeah.
Because when we love and care about someone, right? Even, I'm a therapist. I was not trained in sexual assault and, you know, and that kind of work per se, but, you know, I work with a lot of people and we talk about, you know, their sexualities and, you know, people who've been in really abusive situations, and I can identify it for others, but when it's myself, it's a very different story. I was also watching a movie when I realized how sick the person was who I was with. And, you know, seeing something mirrored back to you, it's like, whoa, oh, okay. There's a yeah, there's a matching that happens, and it cuts really deep. And that's why it's important for people to share these kinds of stories in these nuanced ways so that we can identify and say, oh my God, that's what I'm going through. Oh, I have to do something about this. I can do something about this. I'm watching, you know, like you said, I had to see it through to the end to see what happened to this character, to both give yourself a sense of safety and yourself a sense that there's possibility in maybe justice or change. You know, that there's possibility for change.
This person is one of the people that I was talking about, where hoping that change is possible. He's one of the narcissists that I'm hoping that change is possible, and I really, really, really hope that change is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say this. Sometimes tiny little changes reverberate in big ways. And tiny changes are always possible.
Okay. Okay. Whole different subject. Okay.
Yeah.
PTSD. I am fascinated, and I want to understand what PTSD is.
The way that I understand PTSD in terms of the way we store memories.
Okay.
And the neural pathways that get formed during trauma. Certain antecedents, certain stimuli might pop up in the environment in present day that will trigger us back into the time of the trauma. And, you know, what's really interesting about our biology is that, you know, when we get triggered back, we don't know that we're in a different time. We're literally, it's like a time machine, but we think we're in present, but we're not. And, you know, our biology completely changes to match that of the time. And certain memories get pulled up and will behave as if we're in a state of trauma, when what's happening is something is triggering that state, but the dangers are most likely not present in today. But we can't really differentiate. It's very hard to discern. And the wiring, like you said, there's brain damage. Yeah, I would say there's brain damage, right? Because your wiring gets stuck in not being able to attend to what's happening in the present moment, but you're attending to something unresolved and horrific that happened in the past. There are a lot of different therapeutic modalities that can really help us, and, you know, mindfulness practices also really help with responding to the present moment and returning to a space where you are safe. You know, you don't have to go into that fight or flight, but you could activate your parasympathetic and go into rest and digestion instead of needing to fight or flee.
A large part of what I would like to do with EyeOnDV is to bring men back into the conversation. Oh, women are victimized, men are victimized, women are abusers, men are abusers. It runs the gamut.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because it's something that I feel is so important. You know, in certain partnerships I've had in the past, people have work partnerships. They've wanted to do things for women. And I'm like, I can't leave the men behind. I refuse to leave. They need us. They need this kind of help more than women at this point, because we have left them behind.
Yeah.
And I think that something that is really important is normalizing this kind of vulnerable conversation for men. It also has to do with what we observe in our culture. You know, you and I were both saying, how did we recognize that we're watching a movie, right? It's sharing these stories in this way. It's how we identify. And sometimes when we don't have role models in our lives, and when we don't have the access to, you know, seeking out certain help, we need to get it from, you know, society, from our culture. The truth is, women are wired differently. Our bodies are different. We have thicker corpus callosums. So our capacity to merge left and right brain, the capacity to experience and feel with our capacity to organize and sequence and communicate, it's easier for us. We have the structure that makes it easier. Men, it's not as thick, you know, their brains are different. It's going to take more work. But it's 1,000% possible. You know, it doesn't mean that they're not wired for it. It's just that it does take more work, because, you know, I think evolutionarily speaking, because society wasn't set up where that's the kind of communication men did, you know, things were kept more compartmentalized. And, you know, our biology reflects that. I did a lot of work with Planned Parenthood back in the day, in their education department, and I did a lot of workshops with groups of teens through Planned Parenthood, and we made public service announcements. And one of the topics that I was working with a group of guys, teenage boys, and they wanted to do, you know, what does it mean to have good sex? That's what they want, good, healthy sex. They wanted to make a PSA about good, healthy sex. And what does that mean? And I remember when we were brainstorming this, I was like, well, what does it mean to you? Like, what does that mean to you? And they're like, we don't know. You know, no idea. Like, we know it's not just about wearing a condom, you know, like what does? And one of the things that was so important that came out of that was attending to other, is being able to check in with other. And stepping outside of your own sense of pleasure and pain, and seeing, how is the person I'm with feeling? How are they responding to me? And I think that if we could offer a little bit more, even for our very young people, about sexual development in terms of, what does it feel like just to be near somebody else? What does it feel like when your leg brushes next to them, or your arm brushes next to them? What does it feel like, even in friendship? Does it feel inviting? Does it make you want to give them a hug? Or is it making you want to pull away? And what makes us more comfortable? And what makes us more fearful? So that we can have more awareness, and both in ourselves and in the observation of the people that we're with. Did I do something that made them want to come near me? Or did I do something that made them get a little apprehensive or closed off? So that we could start to gain a little more sensitivity in identifying, is this a healthy, feel-good connection, or is there an unhealthy dynamic happening here, so we can catch it before it gets to a place where someone can become violent.
Yeah.
I'm really glad we touched on the fact that the domestic violence issue is not just a female one, because that is something that is very important to me. And we also see a lot of domestic violence in same-sex couples too, you know. So it's not just in that like heteronormative category, you know, queer couples experience this too. And everyone needs access to this normalization of being able to discuss this topic. And I'm glad both of us got a little vulnerable today and shared, you know, something that was personal.
You are a great therapist. I'll just let you know. I feel so comfortable right now.
Thank you. I'm so glad.
Wow.
I feel comfortable too. You're a great interviewer. I really appreciate the time.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully we can do this again.
I would love that. I would love that. Okay. Yeah. Please stay in touch.
Absolutely. Absolutely.